remembered the line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita. Vishnu is trying to persuade the prince that he should do his duty, and to impress him takes on his multi-armed form and says, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." I suppose we all thought that one way or another.
If you for some reason were to find yourself in the capital city of Jonestown, Guyana, along the Atlantic Ocean coast, at the mouth of the Demerara River of South America, and if you were to take an 8-hour boat ride upstreams along the rivers, through a hinterland of some of the world's most unexplored rainforests, not only would you most likely catch sight of a few undiscovered animals hanging around the very most biodiverse and lush flora, including some of the rarest orchids on this planet, but as you get closer to Port Kaituma, you would also most likely run into some pork knockers, the Guyanese word for freelance gold and diamond prospectors. Now, if you were to befriend them over a drink, to tell them that you came here to visit and check in on your slightly nutty but adventurous and good-hearted cousin, brother or sister from the United States, they would probably direct you the last 11 kilometers southwest of their port. And over there, along the dirt road, your eyes might fall upon a wooden gate that reads, "Welcome to Jonestown, People's Temple Agricultural Project." If the day happens to be November 19, and the year is 1978, then as you pass the gate, your nose would be met by an unspeakable stench in the blazing sun, and further up the road you would come upon a scene which, although you can see it clearly, will remain obscure in its palpable horror for generations to come. Hello, welcome to the very first episode of the show, The Return of the Repressed. I'm your host, Marcus. As you might have guessed, we are going to kick off this new enterprise with a deep dive into the Jonestown event. As with any event of the 20th century, during what Michael S. Judge over at the Death is Just Around the Corner has called the Third World War or the Fourth Reich, the whole story is far from finally established. It might even be too early to be told. It's a little show and lie quote for you. Despite this, I recently had an article published about the incident at the Jonestown Education website after a couple of years of research. Somehow I managed to get out before I was swallowed whole by epistemophilia regarding the Reich's darkest secrets. This sensation, however, might very well manifest once again, as I would like to lead you through the jungle by a mini-series of about an hour-long episodes. Just how many I'm not sure, but if Jimmy Falun Gong managed to do 10 excellent episodes about the Krupps, then I'm sure there will be room for quite a few. A lot has been written about Jonestown, books, articles. There are even a few episodes which have touched upon the topic. However, disturbingly much of it, until this day, has not really managed to penetrate the thick green foliage of sensationalism that surrounds and continues to grow over the abandoned site. I'm sure most of you at one point or another have stepped onto the Wikipedia article only to find a sterile, matter-of-fact chronology mixed in with the usual Red Scare blah blah blah. I think the article even states at one point that Jim borrowed his mind-control capabilities from Mao Zedong. Yeah. Well, the Cold Warriors will believe fucking anything, and there's not much context we can provide to make them see the world different. After all, they are often a part of the institutions which haunted and scared the temple's member all the way into one of the least inhabitable jungles on the planet. Some of them being sanitarians who experienced the Tulsa race massacres as adults, for God's sake. So what I thought we'd do is that I will start off with a historical introduction, and then go on by providing a symptomatic reading of the organization itself, which I think will be a valid one for any tightly connected group, really of any political or religious denomination. It will be a bit theory heavy, but it's for a good cause, just so we get the naive cult pop psychology out of the way, and make sure that any listener understands that your own psychosis is just 3 sleepless nights away. I mean, I really believe this part provides some interesting insights to the art that is the critique of ideology, but there should be nothing really controversial about it. But I will then try to introduce some of those claims that do get labeled ridiculous or conspiratorial, not only because I personally, like many of you, have undergone the training to suss out the influence of the letter abbreviation apparatuses in the most unlikely places, but mainly because that's certainly what the Jonestown inhabitants were dead scared of. On a December day in 1977, the Soviet embassy in Georgetown, capital of Guyana, had 3 unusual visitors. They asked the duty officer if they could see the consul, Fyodor M. Timofeyev. They presented Mr. Timofeyev with a newspaper article, which is written by Bob Levering for the San Francisco Bay Guardian, before most of the People's Temple members moved to Guyana. This was going to function as a kind of third-party introduction to the People's Temple and the organization that these 3 people represented as they were meeting with the Soviet embassy. So I think this is good as an introduction as any, so I'm going to read at length from this article. March 31, 1977. The biggest religion story these days is the phenomenon of People's Temple, that has been in San Francisco less than 5 years, but has already become the largest single Protestant congregation in the state, more than 20,000 members. Participating in activities as diverse as supporting the tenants at the International Hotel, more than 3,000 church members turned out for a demonstration last January, and publishing the monthly People's Forum. They distribute between 600,000 and 1 million copies to every neighborhood in San Francisco. The church also has a free meals program. I mean, just to stop here, it's pretty big, like 20,000 members. And it's the single largest Protestant congregation in the state, that being California, which to my knowledge is the most populous state in the whole of America. Well, let's go on. The church also has a free meals program. It conducts a massive human service program, including its own medical and legal clinics, a home for mentally disabled children, and 4 nursing homes. The leader of this rather unusual church is the Reverend Jim Jones, who was recently appointed to San Francisco Housing Commission by Major Moscone. A quick look at the recent issue of People's Forum indicates the wide variety of concerns his church addresses. There's a lead story on, quote, Laura Allende, Women of Courage, end of quote, about a recent visit to the church by the slain Chilean president's sister. There is an, quote, open letter to local Nazis, end of quote, condemning these, quote, abominable racists, end of quote. A long editorial about the link between unemployment and crime, saying people must, quote, face up to some of the vicious inequities and injustices in our social order, end of quote. A church service at People's Temple is hard to forget. The one I attended took place in the heart of San Francisco's Fillmore district, a mostly black ghetto. People's Temple acquired the building in mid-1972 and uses it as the headquarters for its far-flung operations. The service began at 8:30 p.m. They moved in the church when Jim arrived. He prefers to be called Jim rather than the Reverend Mr. Jones or Pastor Jones. Reminded me of a United Farm Workers rally. Every seat was taken and people were standing in the back and along the walls. The congregation was perhaps 75% black. All ages and races were well represented in the crowd of some 3,000 people. Jim Jones founded the People's Temple in the middle 60s, bringing the message to Los Angeles, where the church acquired a building for its services in late 1972. As many as 200 members make the trek between the San Francisco and Los Angeles churches, using buses from the temple's fleet of 13 converted Greyhounds. Today, the sheer size and scope of People's Temple operation is mind-boggling. Of the church's 20,000 plus members, attendance at a minimum of 5 church meetings is required before someone is admitted to membership. About 9,000 are in San Francisco, 10,000 in Los Angeles, and 1,500 in Ukiah. These are some of the People's Temple programs. A clinic in the San Francisco church, in which about 80 persons are seen each day by qualified nurses. A physical therapy facility in San Francisco for senior and handicapped persons. A drug rehabilitation program in San Francisco that claims to have rehabilitated 300 former drug addicts. Many of the addicts receive training in one of the temple's vocational training programs in fields such as printing, electronics, or auto repairs. A legal aid program in San Francisco where some 200 people a month come with serious legal, usually criminal problems. 4 nursing homes for seniors, each of which has 10 to 25 elderly residents. The article then goes on to cite the various social issues which they are involved in, which leads the author of the article to compare the organization more to a social movement rather than a church. And he claims that being there and listening to "Oh Freedom" and "We Shall Overcome" reminded him of Martin Luther King in the early 60s. A few days after this introduction was done at the Soviet embassy, the 3 members returned, and this time they brought with them Jim Jones's wife, who gave a more detailed introduction of Jim Jones himself. Once again, I'll read at length from this introduction, which was given to Fyodor M. Timofeyev by Jim Jones's wife, Marceline. Jim Jones, born in 1937, grew up in the grinding poverty of the Great Depression in a rural town in Midwestern United States. His earliest experiences were those of the unwanted poor, and the suffering he saw made him determined at an early age to do something about the great social inequities around him. He tells of hearing of the heroic defense of Stalingrad over the radio and the deep impression it made upon him. The valor of the Soviet people during that terrible struggle sparked his interests in the Soviet Union and the principles upon which it was founded. Before long he was reading avidly of the life and struggle of Lenin, and by the time he was 16 he was a Marxist, openly declaring his ideals. And in the closed environment of rural America he was quickly ostracized for those beliefs. By the time he graduated from high school, he was actively involved in work towards the advancement of social causes. The McCarthy period was especially difficult for a man of Jim Jones's conviction and outspokenness. Though he and his associates were severely persecuted, watched, followed, questioned, some had to flee the country, he persisted. Because he quickly saw that the labor movement in the United States had been either transformed into another arm of capitalism or effectively intimidated by the McCarthy witch hunt. He searched for another vehicle to use to politicize working people. The few semi-progressive organizations that remained had been coded into inaction or were so riddled with FBI agents and informers as to be useless. Moreover, it was clear that such progressive or socialist organizations that existed were largely made up of an intellectual elite and had long since ceased to address the problems of the working class or attract its ranks as members. Thus, although a confirmed atheist from his youth, Jim Jones turned to the church as a vehicle for education and organization. The church still attracted large numbers of working people, and by entering the church, Jim Jones recognized that he might be able to subvert this only remaining practical platform for the education of Marxist ideology. Those who entered the doors thinking they were just going to church stayed on to become confirmed socialists and atheists, although they never would have set foot in a political meeting. I mean, the guy, he's crushing it, honestly. This is, I think, the most clever way to organize people in America, not only in the 50s and the 60s, but really today as well. Like, I have spent a lot of time with people who are in these kind of Pentecostalist churches that exist in Europe as well, though they often have their base in America. And I mean, I don't agree with them. I don't go to any sermons or anything. I think they are batshit crazy most of the time, and in the worst cases, an actual danger to society. I'm envious. I'm even envious of the Jehovah's Witnesses. Like, how do they manage to get people to stand outside the subway stations and the train station all over the world? I mean, there's nowhere you can go, I think. I've been around a lot. I've seen a lot of Jehovah's Witnesses handing out flyers and papers, pondering the same stuff over and over again. I mean, really, how do they do it? It's a wet dream for anybody who's trying to organize people politically. I mean, there is no grassroots organization in my peripheries or previous peripheries that I can think of which have had a similar kind of enthusiasm among its members. Really, like, people just showing up, hail and rain, storm, doesn't matter. They just come. And now here's Jim Jones seeing that, like, the unions have been co-opted and that all the elitist student movements is just, you know, upper class kids breaking free from their parents. I mean, this is really the way to go, I think. And he's also targeting the best of people, those who do not need to be convinced about, you know, the dangers of capitalism. Like today on the internet, why are we talking to people like who are educated and who have the, you know, the privilege of enjoying the fruits of other people's labor? They're not going to be interested in a doctrine that says that that's exploitation. They want an excuse. They don't want, like, a conscience. That's not their interest. They're not a part of a class. They're part of their own individual. What are they going to do with class consciousness? Sorry for going on a bit of a tangent here. Shamelessly proclaiming freaking Jonesism to the masses. But yeah, seriously. Yeah, there's a lure. I'll tell you that much. The foreign. There's a lure, definitely. Anyways. This tragedy was so effectful, in fact, that eventually Jones and the People's Temple became a kind of bridge between the less official and more militant organizations of the state of California, such as the Black Panthers, and helped them reach George Moscone, who was at the time the governor of the city of San Francisco. George Moscone himself, incidentally, was later assassinated just a few days after the Jonestown incident. And this is where that Twinkie defense term has its origins. Maybe some of you have seen that Sean Penn film about Harvey Milk. Well, this is the same guy, or this is one of the two guys that were assassinated that day. Granted, it would be quite interesting to return to George Moscone and take a look at just what this Twinkie defense was really covering up.
just that some of these people just charge me with taking money from big corporations and not recording it. I never did that. I never took money from anybody, but the papers believe it. My constituents believe it. They ask me about it. They never see my family.
Can you tell Inspector or ask myself, what was your plan this morning? What did you have in mind?
I didn't have any devised plan or anything. I was leaving the house to see the mayor, and I went downstairs to make a phone call, and I had my gun down there.
Is your gun search property?
It's a gun I have when I was a policeman. It's in my room. And I don't know, I just put it on. Nothing was getting through to me. It was just like a roaring in my ears. And then and then that was it. And I just shot him. Nothing else. Just kind of smirked at me. And then say, too bad. And then I just got all flushed and hot. Shot him.
Before we get too carried away, let's continue this introduction by putting the organization within a broader context that they themselves stated was their context. We shall do that by first taking a look at the aforementioned People's Forum and see what headlines would appear in their own newspaper, which according to their own introduction earlier, was distributed in over 1 million copies in San Francisco. The newspaper's progressive political orientation vividly manifests itself in the rubric, quote, "for the ambitious, curious, and concerned," end of quote, which provides commentary on some of the topics the bourgeoisie press prefers to pass over in silence. Among the questions raised, here are the following. Quote, "The Rockefeller brothers, how they got their fortunes and increased them daily. Their influence over US policy. How does Henry Kissinger, for example, hop right over from being Secretary of State to become a board member of the Chase Manhattan Bank? Question mark. Tie-ins with South Africa." Quote, "Chile. Has the US claimed its full share of responsibility in the overthrow and assassination of Allende? Question mark. How is it perpetuating this dictatorship today? Question mark." End of quote. Quote, "The multinational corporations. By what network do they influence governmental decisions? Question mark. Is it possible for any major decisions to be made independently of the corporate structure? Question mark. End of quote. There are also many questions which are related to the deteriorating conditions at home, i.e. the United States of America. Quote, "Schools. Why do they cost more and more and teach less and less? Why are colleges in deep financial trouble? What kind of job market are students facing and why?" End of quote. Quote, "Prisons. What's behind the push to build more of them? What is the extent of medical experimentation on prisoners? Psychosurgery?" End of quote. Quote, "Medical care. Is there any way to reverse the gigantic machinery which cuts anyone but the wealthy off from extended medical care? Who controls the nursing home circuits?" End of quote. Quote, "Environmental controls. How widespread is pollution, lack of safety standards, poisonous chemicals in foods and other products?" End of quote. Now, I don't know about you, dear listener, since indeed this is probably our first interaction. But this sounds like a based list of topics. Not really the mumbo-jumbo we would spontaneously associate with cults or what they might concern themselves with. Now, I want to avoid for as long as possible, for obvious reasons, any journalistic sources in our investigation. They are already the material for most documentaries and films made about the event, readily available, distributed far and wide. So I'm allowing myself to assume that you didn't come here for that. Thus let us continue with another introduction by a man who was at one point a journalist, but who became a People's Temple member. And there is evidence, an undercover informant, Michael Prokes. We have of course reason to return to Prokes at length in a later episode because he plays an essential part in the story. Prokes survived the event but would later shoot himself in the head at a press conference. His suicide note, which wasn't reported upon by the journalists at the press conference, read, "If my death doesn't prompt another book about the end of Jonestown, my life wasn't worth living." End of quote. Among the rest of his left-behind materials was a short bio about who he thought Jim Jones really was. Once again, I'll read at length from this. When speaking during a service in one of the California temples, Jones would usually trace the oppression of blacks and other minorities to current times. It was almost like a history lesson. He would give long and specific accounts of how blacks, particularly, have been victimized by racism and capitalist exploitation. He would rattle off relevant statistics and examples in meticulous detail. For many blacks who came with no education to speak of, often blaming themselves for conditions they didn't understand, having little sense of self-worth and actually feeling inferior because they had been beaten down by white standards and white institutions for so long. For them, Jones was hell of an eye-opening experience. It wasn't brainwashing that Jones was engaged in, it was more like deprogramming. Jones was educating, and the effect was therapeutic for thousands who heard him and whose lives were in a state of confusion from feeling imprisoned in a society they were told was free. He liberated many minds out of their confused states by demonstrating why there are huge ghettos in every large city of America, and why those ghettos are populated mostly by blacks. He laid the blame squarely at the feet of the white racism and socio-economic system that clearly put profit motives over and above human values, resulting in the lack of opportunity necessary for blacks to enter the mainstream of American life. This was not a demagogic approach Jones was taking either. He had too much of a grasp of his subject. He was too concerned about minute details that a demagogue need not bother with in order to achieve his objectives. Not that emotion wasn't involved, it was, but it was aroused by the sheer logic of his presentation, which were backed by an impressive array of facts, statistics, and documentation gathered from a massive amount of reading. There was no way anyone could dispute what Jones said about the social ills of the society and how blacks were the victims. It was Jones's lucidness that made him effective. What he said made sense. When he would spend hours attempting to show how the system was to blame for the conditions of blacks in the United States, he was convincing.
They survived as only the sons and daughters of God socialism can survive. You can't survive without the spirit of socialism. Pentecostalism, as it was on the day of Pentecost, they had all things common. There is socialism. If thou wilt be perfect, go sell all thou hast and bring it to the apostles' feet, and then it will be distributed from each according to his ability, to each according to his need. So I don't want to do it. Then if you don't do it, you'll live with the people that will be struggling. Your own sisters and brothers will rob your homes, will come in and kill you. Your own daughters and sons will come in and rob you over a crust of bread. You had better come and go with me. to find life and life more abundantly, or your own kin will cut your throat with a dull razor to get one morsel of bread. Capitalism is the Antichrist. The love of money is the root of all evil, and it's going to be so perilous that you will not dream it could be so bad, because that evil system, and this is the seat of the Antichrist, America. Capitalism's seat is here. We openly glorify our dollars. In the dollar we trust. The dollar is our God. We openly glorify that we trust the love of money, that everybody should love money. Ike said, love money. It's the source of all life. Love it, want it. Dr. Eichenhoff, Aaron Coter, Dr. Ike is the Antichrist spirit. He and many like him. They openly say you need money. Only power you want's not people power, not power to help people, but money power, green power. That fulfills the awful prophecy of Scripture, the love of money, capitalism, the root of all evil. The Antichrists are all over this nation. We are the only hope. My God, get on board, little children. Get on board.
What you just heard was a recording from 1974 or 1975. The encouragement to come on board was not a merely metaphoric one. In the way, let's say, a middle boss at a company or a president might beg for the allegiance of his office workers during a conference about how they are all in the same boat. It was quite real. Jones was referring to the organization's latest plan, namely that all those members who aspired to realize and experience the descent of the Holy Spirit of socialism were going to move to Guyana and build a commune called Jonestown. But we might be moving too fast ahead here. You might be wondering, wait a minute, why are these people deciding to leave to the jungle of South America? Are they not one of the fastest growing congregations in the USA? Aren't they at the peak of their political influence in San Francisco and California, the place where everything important happens? So, before we talk about Guyana and where the country found itself in the middle of the last century, which we will do, of course, I promise, because this story is a good one, even without the Jonesists, let's take a look at the reasons the People's Temple might have had for leaving the United States. In general terms, California in the 70s wasn't, indeed if it ever was, a great place for sympathizers of the great proletarian cultural revolution, the good old Wu Chan Jie Ji Wen Hua Da Ge Ming. Show off. When migration planning started in 73, Madman Nixon was still president, and with the end of the war and the oil crisis, America was about to enter the worst phase of its economy in the 4 decades since the Great Depression. And then, as logistics and construction was settled and well underway in Guyana, news broke first in 75 with the President's Commission on CIA Activities within the United States of a strange program designed to psycho-civilize the minds of its subjects. Then in 76, the Church Committee shed more light on what the Hoover Boys had been up to since Jones started preaching in the 50s. It would seem that every political organization the Temple had ever cooperated with had been infiltrated and sabotaged one way or another. It would increasingly also seem, beyond any doubt, that the Reverend's growing mistrust of the white apparatus had been more than well-founded. And if he at times seemed manipulative and paranoid, it was apparently nothing in comparison with the people who were maintaining the turning gears of the WASP intelligence services. Apart from these general tendencies, there were a few specific reasons which applied to the Temple alone. The Temple had for some time dedicated itself to exposing far-right groups and activities which were on the rise in California, a tendency in part due to the selective allocation of resources by the FBI mentioned earlier, At the same time, they sought to inform its public of the struggles carried out by iconic leftists like Huey Newton and Angela Davis. All this, of course, brought the attention of the yellow press, which, just like tabloid journalism, is a liberal moralist term that does not explain much about the structure of the media. So I'll give my own quick rundown of this sociological misapprehension. Liberals on the right of the center use it because of strictly bourgeois economic reasons, since the format is popular and a competition. Liberals on the left of the spectrum use it because of the naive reasons that it hinders members of the working class from becoming entrepreneurs of their own lives and Weltanschauung. That is Freud's term for, let's say, worldview or world outlook. However, the conservative right actually makes use of the format because of both of these reasons. They need to retard the growth of class consciousness among workers, and they need to make more money than the light industry liberals. The National Enquirer and the San Francisco Examiner of William Randolph Hearst are two examples of this observable tendency, which both happen to write unfavorably about the People's Temple from the beginning. Hearst, as you might know, was a fierce anti-communist and was the main inspiration for Charles Foster Kane, the lead character in Orson Welles' film Citizen Kane. During the 1930s and the 1940s, the Enquirer became a voice of isolationism and pro-fascist propaganda. In the late 1950s and through most of the 1960s, the publication was known for its gory and unsettling headlines and stories such as "I cut out her heart and stomped on it, September 8, 1963, and Mom boiled her baby and ate her, 1962. The format of the paper changed in late 1967 by dropping all the gore and violence to focus on more benign topics like celebrities, the occult, and UFOs. Great. Another newspaper in San Francisco, New West of Rupert Murdoch, also sought to change the public opinion of the People's Temple. Murdoch, just like Hearst, is not necessarily renowned for his staunch commitment to the collective ownership of the printer press, or what Marx once called the general intellect. I'll read to you now from a newsletter by the People's Temple, which is trying to answer or counterattack the attacks that had been laid upon it, the organization. Temple good works viciously attacked while ex-Nazi butcher goes free. Have you heard of the ex-Nazi who ordered the execution of 6,000 to 10,000 Romanian Jews during Hitler's fascist Reich, who is living in the United States, now the bishop of an entire Orthodox denomination in this country? Probably not. News of this butcher is scarce, even though he had the bodies of tens of thousands of Jews stamped kosher meat and hung from meat hooks in the slaughterhouse. Even though he has been indicted for lying to the US Immigration Service in order to obtain his US citizenship, there is hardly one word said about him. He moves about freely. Yet more and more news, outrageously biased articles and outright lies have been printed about Jim Jones day after day. Why? We think we have an idea. Among the sources used in most of the vicious stories against the temple is an admitted Nazi. The temple, in its community newspaper, the People's Forum, has openly printed the truth about this ex-Nazi butcher who poses as a man of God. We have consistently run articles exposing the activities of neo-Nazi groups in the US and right here in San Francisco. We were warned months ago not to touch that subject or those people. Yet we have felt strongly that somebody had to print the truth about these Nazis who are thriving in our midst. The paper goes on talking about similar topics. Apart from these media-related reasons for leaving the country, there was also a defection of 8 revolutionaries who were disillusioned with the staff in the organization, which, being made up of mainly white people, they accused of being racist. However, they wanted to make it clear that Jones was still a hero, according to them. He, however, being somewhat shocked regarding this first major defection from the temple, didn't seem to think as highly of them.
Something's happened to us today that can have great effect and cause some of you to come out of your shell and step in the place of those who have lost their way. Or it can give you excuse to trample over love and do the same. Because I'm going to respond to what's happened to me the only way I know how. And that's lovingly. We have had some that I understand who have been in our midst who have worshipped at the feet of Che Guevara. That's only just illusions, no actual documentation for that. But hearsay. But hearsay has given some indication at least that that may be the case. They worshipped the feet of Che Guevara. And Che Guevara has left several wives, and he's left enormous number of children. And he has, in my sense, my term, been guilty of the worst crime that anyone can in reference to historical change. He's not known the tide. He's not been aware of the tide or the current of the wind. Not only did he break the hearts of all those who personally ever depended upon Che Guevara, but he went into Bolivia and created a condition that stirred up a hornet's nest for his own ego, I'm afraid, and brought down the most repressive regime on Bolivia. More tortures have occurred in the past months in Bolivia than occurred in 75 years before. Because one man wanted to put himself before the currents of change. One man wanted to change things more rapidly than he had the ability to change. Or maybe he wanted to run away from the greatest responsibility, and that is living your life in the little way, without a lot of clamor, without a great deal of to-do, but proving that you are a decent human being because you stand and are faithful and dependable in the little ways. Because it seems that all who've been around Guevara, in our group, let's say, have lost their way, tragically lost their way. What has occurred in the last few hours is frightening.
It is, of course, ironic that Jones would accuse Che Guevara of putting himself before the currents of change and avoiding the greatest responsibility of living your life in the little way. But we shall return to that at a later point. The final reason I'm going to provide for why the organization might have felt that they had to leave America was that there was a group formed called Concerned Relatives, which involved a man named Timothy Stowen. He's another important figure in this story, and once again, we have to return to him at a later point. For now, I think it's safe to say that this group, the Concerned Relatives, were a major legal, public and economic concern of the People's Temple. Now to end this introduction and our first episode about the People's Temple and their move to Guyana, I will read you a letter that was sent to the organization by an anonymous writer, which might demonstrate the political conditions at the time of the Exodus. Now that your leader, the Reverend J.J. N-word, has left the country, we would all like the rest of you to follow. Assuming that any of you savages can read, you might have noticed that 83% of non-N-word America wants nothing to do with you. What you should do is return to your roots, that is Africa, and start your own nation. You would be happier, and we sure as hell would be happier. There are white groups forming all across the nation, such as the NSWPP, the Aryan Brotherhood, the National States Rights Party, the National Youth Alliance, some of the Birch Youth, and some of the members of the Young Americans for Freedom. There, young white Americans are forming their own national front. England has a national front, and thousands of them have taken to the streets to attack the N-words of England and drive them out of the country. It will soon happen here, so why not save us a lot of trouble and just set up plans to move back to Africa now? ! Yours for a white America. I don't know if this is a common way to end letters by all white nationalists, but one guy who really liked to do it was Ben Klassen, the man who popularized the term racial holy war. Might have heard about that regarding a certain somebody else about 10 years earlier who listened to the Beatles way too much. This Ben Klassen, he was among other things a natural hygienist who opposed the germ theory of disease as well as conventional medicine. Jews and their microscopes, eh? And he promoted a fruitarian raw food diet. He was also a member of the John Birch Society, which I'm sure must have hated Jones, who incidentally also started off in Indianapolis, Indiana. Maybe one day we can do a whole episode about them. So this is where we will end for today. And next week we will start our symptomatic reading, going through some of the internal psychic mechanisms that kept the group together. Thank you for staying this whole time. I really appreciate it if you did, honestly. Depending on where you found this, I guess like and subscribe, as they say, so that you won't miss when we continue our journey through the jungle. For sources today, I feel obliged to give a shout out to the Jonestown Education Center, or homepage, institute it is, yes, and Fielding McGee, I'm not sure if I pronounced that name correctly, who has done a great job of organizing and transcripting all the documents and audio tapes that were released from the FBI vaults with the help of the Freedom of Information Act. I also made use of pretty much every book that has been published about Jonestown. I'll link the titles in the description for those who are interested. Since I can't really come up with a catchy goodbye, I would like to finish every episode with a poem. And here's one by Sandra Bradshaw, who was a part of the temple but who didn't die in the end. It's called The Debtor. I would offer you something, but everything I have is either borrowed or stolen. Stolen from the bulk of humanity which can claim nothing as its own. The faintest smile, the slightest moment of respite belongs to others. The despair of the millions, the agony of those death claims slowly, is no less mine. The debt is so great, nothing is transferable, no negotiating. When then in this barren womb is the renewal? What is there of nourishment for the untangible? Nothing, but the dying conviction reflected in familiar, trusted eyes. Unqualified commitment is the only redemption.